She used to think that if she stayed quiet long enough, her father would eventually see her. Not as a problem to be managed, not as a daughter to be placed somewhere convenient, but as a person with her own mind, her own plans, her own life waiting to be lived. She had believed that for 26 years. She stopped believing it on a Tuesday morning in October, when his hand came across her face so fast, she didn't even have time to flinch. That was the moment everything changed. And the strange thing was, it wasn't the pain that broke something open inside her. It was the silence that came after. Her mother standing by the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyes on the floor, as if the whole thing was a minor inconvenience, like a spilled cup of coffee. Like it hadn't just happened at all. Waverly had grown up in a small city outside of Ottawa, the kind of place where everyone knew your family's name, and what your father did for a living, and how much your house was probably worth. Her father, Douglas, ran a land surveying company that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was the kind of business that made him feel important in a town that rewarded quiet, steady power, the kind of man who sat on local committees and shook hands at the right events and expected the world to move according to his preferences. Her mother, Paulette, had married him at 22 and spent the next 30 years learning to want what he wanted. By the time Waverly was old enough to notice, Paulette had become so good at agreeing that Waverly sometimes wondered if there was anything left underneath. Any original thought, any buried desire, any version of her mother that had existed before Douglas filled the whole room. Waverly was their only child. She had been a quiet kid, then a studious teenager, then a young woman who read too much and asked too many questions and had the nerve to want things that didn't fit inside her father's idea of appropriate. She'd wanted to study journalism in Toronto. Douglas had said no. She'd wanted to take a gap year and travel through South America with a friend. Douglas had said, absolutely not. She'd wanted to cut her hair short at 19 because she thought it would suit her face better. Douglas had looked at her at the dinner table and said, "You'll do no such thing. You're not a boy." And she hadn't. She'd kept the hair long, applied to the university her father approved of, stayed local, stayed close, stayed small. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself a lot of things to get through the years, and she had gotten very good at believing them. What she hadn't counted on was Terrence. She met him at a university mixer in her second year. Not her university, his. He was doing his MBA, and he had that easy confidence that came from growing up in a family that told him he was exceptional and meant it. He was tall, well-dressed, and charming, in a way that felt genuine until it didn't. At first, Waverly thought she was falling in love. Looking back now, she thinks she was just falling out of her father's house, grabbing onto the first thing that seemed like an exit. Douglas approved of Terrence immediately. That should have told her everything. They dated for 2 years. Terrence came to Sunday dinners and talked about market projections and expansion plans, and Douglas lit up in a way Waverly had never seen him light up for anything she'd ever done. They talked for hours while Paulette cleared plates, and Waverly sat there watching her father fall in love with her boyfriend, thinking, I don't know if this is what love is supposed to feel like. Terrence proposed when she was 24. Douglas sat them both down afterward and outlined what he expected of the marriage, where they would live, what Terrence's role in the family company might eventually look like, how soon they should think about children. Not questions. Statements. A plan he had drawn up without consulting either of them, handed down like a zoning bylaw. And Waverly sat there watching it happen, feeling the same tight sensation in her chest that had been there since she was 12 years old, and asked to play rep soccer, and was told it wasn't feminine enough. But Terrence had nodded along to all of it, and something in Waverly started to go cold. The morning it all broke open, she had gone to her parents' house to tell them she wasn't sure she wanted to go through with the wedding. She'd rehearsed it 100 times on the drive over. She had good reasons. She and Terrence had been fighting constantly. She felt like a prop in a plan she hadn't written. She was 26 years old, and she had never once lived on her own, never made a real decision for herself, never figured out who she was outside of being Douglas Hargreaves' daughter. She sat down at the kitchen table and she said, calmly, that she needed more time, that she wasn't ready, that she wanted to postpone. Douglas looked at her the way he looked at subordinates who brought him bad news. Slow, measuring, already deciding. You're embarrassing yourself, he said. Dad, I just need to think. Terrence is a good man. He has prospects. You're not looking to find better. I'm not looking for better. I'm looking for right. And I don't know if this is Waverly. His voice dropped in that particular way it always had when he wanted her to understand that the conversation was over. You will not do this to this family. I'm not doing anything to this family. I'm talking about my life. She didn't even see it coming. His hand moved so fast it was like a cut in a film. One frame she was sitting across from him, the next her face was turned sideways and there was a burning, ringing silence where her left cheek used to be. She pressed her fingers to her face and looked up at him, and he was already straightening his collar, expression unchanged, like he'd simply set a glass down on a counter. She looked at her mother. Paulette's eyes went to the floor. Waverly left. She sat in her car in the driveway for 4 minutes because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the wheel. Then she drove to her apartment, the one she'd kept for appearances, even though most of her things had migrated to Terrence's condo downtown, and she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed a cold cloth to her face and thought, if you stay, this becomes normal, and you will let it. She didn't go back to her parents' house for 3 weeks. Her mother called twice. Both calls were short and full of careful words. You know how your father gets. He's just worried about you. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Waverly let the third call go to voicemail. She didn't listen to it for 2 days. She went through with the wedding. She knew even as she was putting on the dress that it was the wrong choice. She knew it standing at the front of the church, watching Terrence smile at the crowd, with that particular smile that was never quite for her. She knew it when Douglas walked her down the aisle and squeezed her hand and murmured, "Good girl," in her ear like she was still 10 years old and had just finished her piano recital without mistakes. But she smiled. She said her vows. She signed her name. And she told herself that the tightness in her chest was nerves and that it would pass. It did not pass. Living with Terrence was different from dating Terrence. When they were dating, she had been a destination. Now she was furniture, present, necessary, but not particularly interesting. He worked long hours and came home distracted, and had strong opinions about how the apartment should look, and how she should dress for his work events, and who she should be when his colleagues were around. He didn't raise his voice often. He didn't have to. He had other methods. He'd dismiss things she said in front of people with a light laugh. Waverly always dramatizes, and move on before she could respond. He'd go quiet for days if she did something he considered embarrassing, and she'd find herself apologizing without fully knowing what she'd done. He controlled the finances with what he called efficiency, and she called something she didn't have a word for yet, but felt in her stomach every time she wanted to buy something without asking. His mother, Rosalind, came to stay with them for 2 weeks in February and did not leave until April. Rosalind was a small woman with very precise opinions about how a house should be run and how a daughter-in-law should behave. She rearranged Waverly's kitchen the first week she arrived, moving everything to places that made sense to her. She left little notes. She made pointed remarks about dinner timing and dust and how Terrence had looked tired lately and wasn't Waverly making sure he was eating properly. When Waverly mentioned to Terrence that she found his mother's comments difficult, he went quiet for 4 seconds and then said, very evenly, "My mother is trying to help. I don't know why you always have to make things adversarial." There was no conversation after that. Just the silence, which had its own weight, and Rosalind in the kitchen the next morning, humming to herself while she reorganized the pantry for the second time. Waverly called her best friend, Daphne, from a parking lot during her lunch break that February, and talked for an hour. Daphne listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Waverly finally ran out of words, Daphne was quiet for a moment and then said, "Wav. You know what this sounds like, right?" Waverly did know. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. The thing people don't understand, if they've never been in it, is that it doesn't feel like a pattern when you're inside it. It feels like a series of isolated incidents, each one with a reasonable explanation. He's under stress at work. His mother is difficult for everyone. You are being too sensitive. You have always been too sensitive. Your father told you that too, and maybe they're both seeing something real. Maybe this is who you are. Maybe this is what you deserve. She stayed for another 8 months. She stayed because she was afraid of her father's reaction. She stayed because she had no money of her own and didn't know how to start. She stayed because every time she got close to the edge of leaving, Terrence would have a good week. Warm, attentive, the version of himself she'd first fallen for. And she'd think maybe this time it was turning around. What finally moved her was small, and she's never been quite able to explain why it worked when so many larger things hadn't. She was sitting at the kitchen table one evening while Rosalind and Terrence watched television in the next room. And she was going over her schedule for the following week, and she realized there was not a single hour in it that belonged to her. Every obligation, every appointment, every planned meal was organized around someone else's needs. She wasn't in her own life. She was a supporting character in a story written by other people, and she had been for as long as she could remember. She called Daphne at 10 o'clock that night. "I need help figuring out how to leave," she said. "Okay," Daphne said. "I've been waiting for this call. Come over tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you need." She left on a Wednesday. Terrence was at work. Rosalind had finally gone back to Mississauga the week before. Waverly packed 2 bags and her laptop, and the small framed photo of herself and Daphne from university. And she walked out of the condo at 9:15 in the morning and drove to Daphne's place in Canada. Daphne had made coffee and cleared out the spare room, and didn't make her talk about it until she was ready. She wasn't ready for 2 days. When she finally told the whole story, from the kitchen table with her father to the parking lot conversation to the 8 months of staying, Daphne listened to all of it and then said quietly, "You're not too sensitive, Wav. You never were." Waverly cried for a long time after that, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular exhaustion of having held something up for too long and finally being allowed to put it down. The months that followed were hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. Leaving wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning of a different kind of difficult. Terrence called repeatedly at first, then stopped calling and started using lawyers. Douglas called once to tell her she was destroying the family's reputation. Paulette sent a card that said she hoped things would work out, which Waverly put in a drawer and didn't take out again. She got a small apartment in Centertown. She went back to work full-time at the communications firm, where she'd been working part-time since university. She started therapy with a woman named Dr. Obasi, who had a calm, unhurried manner and the particular skill of asking questions that made Waverly realize she already knew the answer. In one of their early sessions, Dr. Obasi asked her what she'd wanted to be when she was a child. Before her father had started shaping the answer, Waverly had to think about it for a long time. "A journalist," she finally said. "I wanted to tell people stories. I thought that mattered. What do you think now?" "I think it still matters. I think I just stopped believing I was allowed to be the person who did it." She enrolled in a night course at Carleton that fall. Introduction to Broadcast Journalism. She sat in a classroom with students who were mostly 21 and 22, and she didn't care she did the assignments. She was good at them. Her instructor, a former CBC producer named Mick Fowler, told her after the 3rd week that she had instincts and she should trust them. She wrote that down and put it in her wallet. She didn't think about men. She was too busy building a floor to stand on. She met Thomas at a community fundraiser for a legal aid organization in the spring. Not the way people meet in stories. No dramatic eye contact across a crowded room. He was volunteering at the registration table, and he handed her a name tag and mispronounced her name and apologized. And she said it was fine and moved on. Later in the evening, she ended up next to him during the silent auction section, and they started talking because the auction lots were boring and neither of them had bid on anything. He was a civil engineer who worked on municipal infrastructure. He had a daughter, Lily, who was 7, and shared custody with his ex-wife. He was easy to talk to in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He wasn't working to impress her, just actually having a conversation. She was careful. She didn't call it anything for a long time. She told Daphne she'd met someone interesting, and Daphne gave her a look that said she could see right through the hedge. Thomas was patient in a way she hadn't encountered before. He didn't push for more of her time than she offered. When she told him, on their 4th date, that her last relationship had been controlling and that she was still figuring things out, he nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me that. We'll go at whatever pace makes sense." And then he changed the subject because he could see she was bracing for a reaction, and he didn't want to make her feel like a confession to be managed. Lily was a curly-haired, relentlessly curious 7-year-old who could talk at length about the life cycle of frogs and was currently obsessed with making her own comic books. The first time Waverly met her, at a Saturday morning at a park, low pressure, Thomas's suggestion, Lily had immediately asked Waverly if she knew what a salamander was and did she want to see one because there was definitely one under that log over there. "I absolutely do," Waverly said. They looked at the salamander for a long time. Thomas stood back and let it happen. That was when Waverly thought, "Oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like." She called her mother in late summer. Not because Douglas had asked her to. Not because she felt obligated. She'd done enough things out of obligation to last her whole life. But because she found herself thinking, in quiet moments, about the woman her mother might have been before the long years of agreement had worn her down. She wasn't sure she could forgive her yet, but she thought she could try to understand her. The call was short and careful on both sides. Paulette sounded smaller on the phone than she did in person. She said she thought about Waverly often. She said she was sorry things had been hard. She didn't say anything about Douglas or the kitchen table, and Waverly didn't bring it up. Not yet. But it was a beginning, a thin, fragile thread that hadn't been there before. She didn't call her father. She wasn't ready for that, and she had made herself a promise when she left Daphne's spare room and moved into her own apartment. She would not do things before she was ready anymore. She would not rush herself to be okay for someone else's comfort. She would not apologize for the pace of her own healing. It was a harder promise to keep than it sounded, but she kept it. The journalism course led to a second course, which led to a freelance piece she submitted to a regional magazine, almost on a dare to herself. They accepted it. It was a profile of a woman in Gatineau who had built a small business repairing vintage radios, and Waverly had spent 3 hours in her workshop asking questions, and the woman had been warm and exact and full of good stories. When the piece came out, Mick Fowler sent her an email that said simply, "See? Instincts. Trust them." She printed it out and put it next to the note in her wallet. By the time autumn came around again, she had her own apartment, her own small savings account, a freelance portfolio she was quietly proud of, and a relationship she had walked into with her eyes open and her past fully visible. She had told Thomas most of it. Not all at once, but in pieces. The way you share things when you trust someone enough to let them see you put together, and also not. He had listened each time without trying to fix it or rush past it. One evening in October, exactly a year after she'd sat in her car in her parents' driveway with shaking hands, she was on Thomas's couch with Lily asleep in the next room, and a mug of tea going cold on the side table, and Thomas asked her if she was okay. Not the reflex question, the real one. She thought about it honestly before she answered. "I'm more okay than I've ever been," she said, which I know sounds small, but it's not. "It's not small," he said. She looked around the room. At Lily's comic books stacked on the corner shelf, at the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, at the ordinary goodness of a Tuesday evening with no dread in it. And she thought about the girl who'd kept her hair long, because her father told her to, who'd said her vows knowing they were wrong, who'd sat in parking lots crying into her phone, because she couldn't find the door out. She didn't feel sorry for that girl. She felt something softer, something closer to understanding. That girl had done the best she could with what she had been given. She had survived a kind of weight that people on the outside rarely see because it leaves no marks you can photograph. But she had gotten out, she had found the door and walked through it, and she had built something on the other side. Not all at once, not without help, not without Daphne's spare room and Dr. Obasi's careful questions and Thomas handing her a wrong-pronounced name tag at a fundraiser table on an ordinary Thursday night. She picked up her tea. Outside, the Ottawa River would be going dark and silver in the October light. The way it always did at this time of year, reliable as anything she'd ever known. She had a piece due Friday. She had a salamander-obsessed child sleeping down the hall. She had a life that was for the first time recognizably hers. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.